Well, good afternoon, everyone. The final day of the speaker series. It's been such an honor to have so many great presenters say yes to my request to speak this week. We've had such a great variety. And today, Davis is no exception, and I can't wait to see his presentation. Just want to start off by acknowledging I am on the stolen ancestral unceded territory of the Syilx people who stewarded the lands for thousands upon thousands of years. And then within the span of 200 years, settlers arriving with a different worldview, with different priorities, wanting ownership instead of stewardship, not looking 7 generations down the road, just looking for the here and now, the money, the greed. And, we're just in such a different situation. It's heartbreaking. I've made relationships with Indigenous elders, and that is what fuels my climate action, because whenever I look at the lake, whenever I look at the mountains, I know it's just so much worse than 200 years ago. Jamie said it yesterday, they used to be able to walk across the lake on the backs of salmon. There were so many salmon, and Indigenous people would never eat all the salmon. They would never eat all the berries. They would never consume everything. They always left some for future harvest, left some for the animals, left some for the just ongoing cycle of life. And so with that is why I truly continue and will continue caring about the environment, doing what climate action I can, and helping to raise awareness with other people. So thank you very much. And Davis, I'm going to let you take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy, for that introduction and for your land acknowledgement. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to begin sharing my screen here.
I can see that just fine. Thank you.
Thank you. So the topic of my presentation here today is climate resilient planning for stronger communities. I'm going to just cover a few basic topics on the subject. This is a topic that has gained increasing prominence, particularly since the pandemic. It's gained an increasing focus amongst all generations, learning about the topic through books, through YouTube, through Instagram. And it's increasingly important in a city like Kelowna, a city that has seen, as Tracy was saying, so much change. Being able to talk about these issues in a way that centers the climate and centers the quality of life for those inhabiting the area is important. And I'm hoping to provide some information, a somewhat deep dive on a rather small amount of topics, so that you have some practical applications that we can talk about in the question and answer period, a discussion period, I should say, at the end of the presentation, where we can talk about how these issues are affecting us, our daily lives, and how we want to move forward as community members. So just a little bit about myself to begin. So I'm currently president of the Kelowna Area Cycling Coalition. We were spun off from a city committee in 2003. Generally, what we do begins with infrastructure advocacy. We believe in streets that are safe for everyone. That means streets that are safe for people who drive, but safe for people who bike, and safe for people who walk, who use wheelchairs, who use transit, etc. And so much of that is creating protected bike lanes, creating protected intersections, improvements to intersections with items like continuous sidewalks and roundabouts. And we work with city staff on critiquing designs, critiquing everything from the design of grates for wastewater management to the actual width of the bike lanes themselves and their placements on a road, the difference between a bidirectional bike lane and one that goes on both sides of the street. And we do this while advocating for Vision Zero, which I'll touch on later in this presentation. In addition, we like to give back to the community. We have a subcommittee that's the Cycling Without Age subcommittee, and we have three-wheel bicycles. We call them trishaws, where volunteers from our organization, wonderful people, go to local seniors' homes. And then they take people out for rides, recreational rides on some of the protected bike network in our community. And this is very well received by the seniors themselves and by the homes. And we're thankful for that partnership, and we're thankful for the grants that we received. Just this past year, we received $25,000 in the New Horizons grant to buy more trishaws. So we're very happy with that program. And we've also been encouraging more people to bike in our community, not just through infrastructure advocacy, but through bike valets. You can see here a picture of the bike valet for Meet Me on Bernard last year. This is essentially advocating for less theft in our community and providing options for people. We're, fingers crossed, going to be offering this in the peak of summer at the farmers market. I'm also vice chair of the Regional District of the Central Okanagan's Planning Advisory Committee. We provide advice to the electoral area directors and city councillors that make up the RDCO board on planning and housing issues on the South Slopes, for Ellison, for Fintry, these communities that are outside of municipal jurisdiction. We also are providing advice on OCP renewal. I'm starting up a Strong Towns chapter here in town, so I'm hoping to be the community discussion organizer beginning later this month. And my day job is in procurement and contracting for the Ministry of Children and Family Development here in British Columbia. So my presentation topics cover these four areas, cover some general city planning principles and why many people, including the Cycling Coalition, including myself, view mixed-use zoning as a better path forward for communities. I'm discussing the net positives and net concerns with infill housing and how to best manage this in a community. I'm discussing parking minimums and what that actually means for a community and how a more traditional approach to development, both on zoning, on housing, and for parking, could lead to a more climate-friendly community, a community with lower emissions. And then I want to focus a little bit more on Vision Zero standards, what that means, because that is really the core purpose of the Kelowna Area Cycling Coalition. These are some books and YouTube channels on some of these subjects that I would highly recommend that are you can get at the Okanagan Regional Library. Jeff Speck, his original book, Walkable City, and this book, Walkable City Rules, is all about creating better places. And I hope our elected officials and engineers and city planners read these books, and they're available for the community as well. Those of a certain generation would certainly know the name Jane Jacobs and everything she had to say about community-oriented city planning as well. There's the more academic books that are available at the library, like the one on the bottom right, and YouTube channels like RM Transit and Not Just Bikes provide a good visual way to, if you ever want to learn more about some of the information covered in this presentation. Of course, always feel free to contact me after the end of this presentation if you'd like to have some avenues to explore on some of these topics. So I first want to provide a brief history of how cities in North America have traditionally been planned since the 1930s. And that comes back down to Euclidean zoning. So Euclidean zoning was named after a landmark 1926 Supreme Court case in the United States. It was the Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company. Originally in America, if you wanted to keep an area very expensive and high quality, at least perceived for the people that were doing this kind of restriction, the Supreme Court up until the 1920s literally did racial covenants. But then thankfully, those were ruled unconstitutional in both the United States and Canada. So there were new ways that city planners wanted to establish barriers between neighborhoods and some segregation by income between neighborhoods. And that's really where Euclidean zoning came into play. It was designed to separate land uses to mitigate impacts of traffic and concerns with urban congestion, industrial pollution, and incompatible land uses by really picking some lines on a map. You would have more of a single family residential space, which you can see there, some park space. You would also have institutional space. You have the multifamily residential separated from that, and you have the commercial separated from that. And this, when you actually think about it, is a division of land uses. It has they came with setback requirements, building height limits, and other natural regulations to maintain the character of every zone. And this was a profound change. It really influenced city development patterns. It went from the traditional continuous city blocks and long streets that you see in the kind of core areas of Kelowna versus the looping suburban cul-de-sacs that you see from the 70s onward. Single-use zoning here, it's a sub-application of Euclidean zoning, and it's traditionally what Kelowna uses until this day. But we're beginning to see from the Strong Towns organizations, from certain city planners, a focus on more mixes of uses, a pre-1930s school of development, and there's many ways that this has climate impacts. But I'll first just describe the two types here. You have directly a wood frame building with perhaps a restaurant, a cafe, or a grocery store or barber shop on the ground level, and apartments above, and you simply have auxiliary commercial, like the largest picture on the screen here. That's a cafe where there's a local landlord who lives in the building behind the homeowner, but also they've converted a garage or a former garage, some other building. They've converted something on their property because city laws allowed them to, into a very popular local cafe. I believe this is in Seattle. And now there's a patio area outside, but they're an owner operator. They're entrepreneurs that both live on a property and operate their business on their property. And that's a very radical thing in Kelowna. You have this occasionally with hairdressers, with certain massage parlors, but a home-based business is something that is almost entirely banned in our city. And that's something that might be beginning to change in the future. Back in the day, there were 20 to 30 of these neighborhood commercial or home-based businesses. You can see one example of a more neighborhood commercial building on the right with the Bankhead convenience store. Pandozzi Food Basket is another example of legacy zoning that would not be in place today had it not been for a traditional grocery store at that location. Lakeview Market was an early example of that still exists. And there's a couple other in the downtown and Rutland areas as well. But there's climate impacts for mixed use zoning. There's pedestrian friendly environments where you have a choice, not an obligation, but a choice to be able to meet your neighbors and go to a local coffee shop, or if you just need one or two things on your grocery list, oh well, I'll just hop down the street over there instead of driving all the way to Costco. And this has vibrant community impacts as well. You have people getting to know each other in their own locations because there are these so-called third spaces, places that you don't go directly to someone's house. You're not just walking by on the street, but a place to mingle, a place to create a neighborhood, a place to create a community of people who know each other and connect a little bit more. It provides that opportunity, and it provides these opportunities for entrepreneurs, local businesses to really compete with the big chains, because more small commercial spaces, small little spaces that a local can actually afford, are important for building local community resources and a local based economy. So this is all about optimizing land use in Kelowna, where we want to protect our agricultural land, where we wouldn't want to build suburban sprawl into the forest fire interface and pave over our natural areas. It's about making the best possible use of land in ways that would support the local economy and create more opportunities for resiliency and more opportunities for quality of life and local connection. So this next slide is important. Our second topic, here today, is on infill housing done properly. And of course, those last two words in brackets are critical. It's no surprise to anyone that older buildings are not very efficient. They were designed with basically before the invention of modern step code. They can have leaky windows, they can have poor insulation, they can be gas fired, and these are all issues. And sometimes infill housing can be done well. If you're preventing suburban sprawl, if you have step code alignment with new builds, we're moving towards zero carbon step code here in British Columbia. If you retain site coverage rules for rain management, for green space, and for tree canopy protection and tree canopy bylaws for neighborhoods. There are ways to actually talk about housing the people who grow up and live in a community, housing the people who choose to move to the community, like my family and I did when I was 6 years old. And there are ways to do this in a way that supports climate action. This is a link I embedded. If you'd like to have access to this presentation, I really recommend this BC Climate Action Toolkit. But as you can see, if you're kind of thinking about building efficiency, if you're kind of thinking about creating housing in a way that has the lowest climate impact, Infill checks off a couple of boxes. You would have heating electrification, which you can see up as a separate category. You have VMT reduction, that's vehicle miles traveled per capita. Infill done close to a commercial space, close to a school, is always going to result in less driving compared to a suburban house at the farthest end of McKinley or Upper Mission, and energy efficiency as well. There are obvious concerns to have when you talk about infill housing and making sure that everyone in a community feels included, and that their feedback is extremely important. But theoretically, as in a climate perspective, infill housing can have benefits, and that's why the Cool Climate Network in 2018 called it their top priority. This is another thing that people might not know about. In the zoning bylaw, when you go look at a great big building that's being built, like Water Street by the Park in downtown Kelowna, you might not know that the city bylaws actually require a certain amount of parking to be built there. This is new. That only started in relatively new, let's say. That only started in the 1970s. The beautiful heritage areas that we have, all of these, when you walk by the buildings, you'll note one thing in common is that all of these beautiful buildings, but one of the reasons that they're beautiful is they have no garages. They were all built before these parking minimums were in effect, even though there were plenty of cars in Kelowna in the 1930s and 40s. But there is a city hall document that says, depending on the land use, depending if it's residential, what type of commercial, exactly how many parking spots. And for a building like the one on the left there, these end up costing between $100,000 and $50,000 per spot. And that gets lumped in whether the person wants it or not when they buy their condo or whatever, that they end up paying for that. And the concrete used in these parking podiums is much, much greater, and concrete has quite a large embedded carbon impact. The concrete used in those podiums is much, much thicker to support the weight of all those cars compared to the concrete used in the towers themselves. And this map on the right was made by my friend Thomas Martin, former Green Party of British Columbia candidate in Kamloops, of all the surface parking lots in downtown Kelowna. Well, I don't know if this is the most efficient use of that land. Nobody really can say for sure. All we can say is that much of that is actually required by the city government themselves. And perhaps additional green space, perhaps additional affordable housing, perhaps there are other options for some of this land that could be used in other ways that would benefit the community, but it is City Hall that is determining that a parking lot, hardly something that is good for the environment for just the heat island effects alone, let alone the opportunity cost of housing or green space there. That is the requirement of the city, generally speaking. And as you can see, it takes up quite a bit of room. Cars aren't exactly small, especially when they're parked all together. So that's a bylaw that we have. And cities like High River and Edmonton and Spokane and cities larger and smaller than Kelowna have moved away from strict parking minimums to managing the supply to ensure everyone has accessibility and can park their car in different ways. And This is probably one of the next frontiers of city planning that has only happened in a couple hundred cities and towns in North America so far, but it seems like this is on the way out mainly because of the opportunity costs involved and the green space that is lost through these regulations. Finally, putting on my bike hat, my bike helmet, I should say, I'd like to talk a little bit about Vision Zero. So Vision Zero is an approach for traffic safety. Ultimately, it's aimed at eliminating zero all fatalities and serious accidents in a transportation network. So essentially a street grid. It's about increasing safe, healthy, and equitable mobility for all road users, be they cyclists, be they someone who uses a wheelchair, be they pedestrians, or perhaps even transit users and car drivers. It's really about an ethical commitment that says that traffic deaths and injuries are in fact preventable and unacceptable. Um, Cities like Hoboken have actually managed to eliminate traffic deaths in their community for almost 9 years in a row now, based on following these Vision Zero principles. And of course, countries with better intersection and road design standards, such as those in the Netherlands and France, have significantly lower fatalities and injuries per capita than North American cities like Kelowna. So this is the other principles are a systemic approach. We really need to move away from blaming individuals for having an accident. If they're not on their phone, if they're not drunk, but they still have an accident, that might not necessarily be a personal responsibility. That might be a systemic issue. And we need to look at data driven approaches to fixing this. Data driven, as in you can look at the ICBC data and see exactly how many crashes there have been at every intersection and every year over the past 7 years or so, but so often a crash happens and absolutely no design changes are made, even if it results in a fatality, even if there are glaring safety flaws with that intersection. So the key components of Vision Zero are safe street design, of focusing on engineering measures like traffic calming, like protected bike lanes, like pedestrian crossings, and road design modifications to actually reduce vehicle crashes and impacts and the severity of those impacts when they do occur. It's about evaluation and accountability. It's about looking backward at a road design, at a road modification, saying, does this work? Is this being monitored? Is this being evaluated? Does this actually have tangible outcomes that leads to safety for people? And I know this might all sound quite theoretical here, but I like to provide some specific examples. So on the left here, we have what would be called a neck down with the colorful street art. The road is just as passable for all vehicles and all pedestrians. All vehicles can still continue. I believe it's a four-way stop. They can turn left, turn right, go straight. But you can see how the actual turning radiuses have been made tighter. So cars do need to slow down more when they turn, and the angle of approach of the crosswalk is different. Pedestrians have less far to walk, and the drivers are more looking directly at the pedestrians by the time they enter the crosswalk. So they're not in the T sections of the car, so there's no blind spots for the drivers. So this daylighting of the intersection results in a safer crossing experience for pedestrians. You can also see a protected bike lane here. Personally speaking, I'm not much of a fan of bidirectional protected bike lanes, but essentially we have a space that is protected for people with pedestrians and for cyclists, that has a robust tree canopy and even some garden boxes, and that still allows full mobility for vehicles and drivers on the street there you can see on the right. So it's a complete street that works for all road users, that is safe for all road users. This last one I would highlight is a continuous sidewalk. This is a very important accessibility concern for people who use walkers or wheelchairs. You don't actually have to step down to the curb to cross the street. Instead, the curb meets you. It rises up to meet you. Anyone who's crossed a road in the winter and gotten their shoe wet when they step off a curb into a wet gutter knows exactly what I'm talking about. So this is where, even though the turning radius of the road is still quite broad, it still would allow theoretically speed. you have essentially a speed hump, a traffic hump. So there's natural traffic calming. So pedestrians, they don't need to step down. Cars rise to meet the intersection. This gives pedestrians priority. This lowers speeds for cars when they turn the corner. And there's protective bollards as well to prevent out of control vehicles from ever approaching the sidewalk. So what we have here are design principles, engineering principles. Vision Zero is not about education. Education plays no role. Vision Zero is not telling people to pick up a flag and wave it as they cross the street, or even to look both ways, so you still should. Vision Zero, it understands that victim blaming is not a way to functional way to improve road safety, and that traffic accidents, when they occur, cannot be blamed on the education of the pedestrian. So I wanted to really um, emphasize here that I haven't really talked about climate change very much, but everything from the walkability of neighborhoods, for the efficiency of buildings, to the amount of concrete used in buildings, to the amount that people might choose to cycle if they're young and healthier, or take transit, or walk if they only have a small distance to go, or work in a neighborhood where they live so they don't need to drive to where they go. Just the fact of a new building having a heat pump instead of a gas furnace. All of these community planning ideas, this idea of building housing in a community instead of at the edge of a community where people need to drive everywhere. All of these things have climate impacts. And that's what I really want to highlight is all too often I found myself as director of the Cycling Coalition concerned that that median voters in a conservative city have conservative priorities, and that's why I like to emphasize practical benefits for everyone beyond climate concerns, while always prioritizing activities that have positive climate impacts, because um, livability and affordability and green space and quality of life, those are universal values, and if those have climate impacts as well, that's how climate wins can be won. So I would just encourage you to learn more about these topics, to reach out to me or to someone else. If you'd like to learn more on these topics, to go on YouTube, to read books on the subject, and ultimately, one last thing, to volunteer. I would note that this is a provincial election year, and for a party that represents your values, that takes climate change seriously, I would encourage you to sign up and volunteer for them, because voter turnout, having everyone stand up and be counted, is critical to ensure that climate resiliency and climate focused policies are prioritized by our elected officials while they talk about other important issues like the cost of living and ensuring everyone has a roof over their head. So I just wanted to thank you once again for listening to my presentation, and thank Tracy for the opportunity to speak here today. And I would like to really, well, I'll close out of this presentation, and if we want to have a conversation about some of these or other topics, I would love to have that. So thank you so much.
Oh, amazing. Thank you, Davis. Davis was invited to be a speaker because he's done the hard work. He knows what he's talking about. He completely understands what solutions there are and how they could actually be implemented to just improve the quality of our lives as well as improve reducing pollution and everything else. And I just want to mention, Davis ran for city council last year. I was gutted. He came ninth. It was so close. And, I'm desperately hoping and fairly confident that Davis will run again. And this is the sort of person we need on council, someone who understands the policies that can be put in place and how they can better the community. Because if we don't have community, and if we don't have a livable community, then what is the point, really? Do we really want to just live by being in an individual car on the outskirts, having no connection with neighbors, no connection with anything? It's so isolating. And I actually love the way that Davis framed a choice, not an obligation. We want choices. We're not saying nobody can have a car. We're saying, let's have a choice. I have a car, but I want 2 items to stock up the fridge. And there's a grocery store 3 minutes walk away. Do I really want to spend my life in traffic for 2 items of groceries? So thank you so much, Davis. And Laurie's got a hand up, so let's get cracking on questions.
I was just going to say that it's really important that people like Davis run. Nanaimo is a really good example, I think, of a city that has gotten people onto the council, not just one, but a cohort who have vision of like donut economics and strong towns and bringing people together. It is really hard when so many people are pushing back against change because nobody likes change. It's very uncomfortable. But all these changes are required for us to survive and for us to thrive in our communities. It's known that change has to happen, and it's expensive if we don't change. And that's always another way of bringing it down when you're talking to people, although for me, sometimes that's hard, but it's about the cost. It's a cost to our health. It's a cost to our pocketbooks. It's a cost to our city if we don't do all of these changes. That was really inspirational, Miles. I don't really have a question. Or Davis, sorry. I don't
Well,
really
no,
have a
thank you,
question.
Lori. I just wanted to say, you're so right that Nanaimo does a really good job. I'm very happy that Victoria has quite a good council right now. They accelerated all the way to zero carbon step code, and that was inspirational. And Victoria has a wonderful old downtown that really has a walkability that Kelowna can't even meet on Bernard or Pandosy. The only other thing I would mention is, so much of this, thankfully, is also about climate resiliency. Passive houses have so many potential impacts because smoke is becoming an increasing concern in Kelowna. And even though we have, air filters and things like that, it's a health risk. And having a house that is safe with clean air in it is a basic livability requirement. So I thank you for sharing, though. And I would agree completely that Nanaimo is a wonderful example. I see Erica has her hand up as well.
Yep. Thanks, Davis. That was great. My question, I guess, is I live, as you know, in the Abbott Street Conservation Area. And one of the, working with Kassan over the years, they, introduced the RU7 zoning, which was great idea. And we supported, the need for infill housing and increasing affordable housing and densification, because we're a walkable neighborhood, so we should have a lot more choices, more people, and need to densify. But the concern, what the city planning did was, this RU7 zoning. They had one basically the same. All the lots, they designate a certain area for RU7, and everyone kind of a cookie cutter approach. Developers, they had, the building plan was replicated many times, and that for the 4 units, and they basically took down all the trees, all the shrubs, everything on the lot. The city did not go in, first of all, like they did on Costin, and build kind of, the recreation corridor like we have on Abbott. So, and there was no sidewalks. Even looking at Springfield, there was no sidewalks. And so these people, there was nowhere to park cars. Everyone was parking right on the road. It was just a mess. It has been a mess. And of course, we lost many trees, and because there were supposed to be design guidelines. Well, they never implemented any design guidelines, which they had promised, because I was actually on a committee that came up with, you know, the RU7. Supported RU7, but there were supposed to be design guidelines. So I'm just wondering what's your feeling? Like, you know, now the province is introducing this blanket, like everyone loves, oh, that's great. What a great way to go. You know, we'll densify. And as you say, it's a great way is for older neighborhoods, like let's increase the density, but how do you do it and still preserve livability and trees and, you know, walkability? So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, the devil is, like you said, in the details. And I personally think that, like you do, that there were a lot of problems in the city's RU7 zone. Um, it comes down to essentially what we prioritize as a community. So there's a couple of different ways to approach this. There's thankfully, we're getting hopefully another BC government changes for point access blocks. What right now, what we need apart, if you're ever going to build a fourplex, it has to be 2 stories, because if not, if it gets to 3 stories, now you're building an apartment building with windows on one side and corridors, and it's a rather blocky building because of fire rules. But they're changing those rules, so hopefully you see more European style courtyard apartments with windows and 2 and 3 sides. And there are things happening there. But the biggest problem with RU7 is that they chose less, and this is a personal opinion of mine, but I would always sacrifice lower lot coverage for a bit more height. The thing with RU7 is it covers almost the entire lot. There's no tree protection requirement, so you basically just raise a lot, and then all the trees that were there before are gone. The amount of green space in the new development is quite minimal, and you end up with a rather short, squat building that the units are a decent size on the inside, maybe 900 to 1200 square feet, which is a starter home. And if the step code is good, their operational carbon impacts are going to be more limited. But personally speaking, if you could focus on lower lot coverage, and I would trade some height for that, then you at least have more green space. You can begin talking about tree protection and heritage values just by actually having those be there still. Like the last thing we want is a bunch of fourplexes in Abbott or another neighborhood where all the progress made on tree canopy in the last 70 years is reversed, and then all you get out of it is a bunch of cookie cutter buildings. So yeah, I think that you've raised a lot of valid points, and that the planning does need to be modern or to be traditional. And traditional, I would call 1930s or before, and modern would be just what's coming online now with the provincial government submit. So ideally, you do the sidewalks properly. The city has a very, very limited sidewalk budget. They're advancing a $100 million bundle of transportation improvements, but there's no additional sidewalk plans in that plan. I'd like to see a greater focus on protected bike lanes, on multi-use paths, and on sidewalks in our community. So yes, if you're going to be infilling an area, the streets have to be urbanized. And that means, yes, if there's going to be car parking on the side of a street, actually having that curbing, actually having those street trees. So yes, I know this is a roundabout way of answering your question, but there are issues with RU7. Those issues were created, I think, by some city planning principles that really prioritize the height of buildings over other aspects. And I think that was to the detriment of the neighborhoods. So I think there's a path forward that allows for more wins. The only thing would be is with those more wins would probably come an increase in height of some wood frame buildings. So not everyone is going to like every solution, but I think that there's a balance, a healthier balance that could be struck on some of that. I hope that kind of answered your question.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Hi there. Davis, thanks for a great overview of the topic in there. I wanted to ask a question about parking minimums. So it seems like on the one hand, adding car spots within a building has a carbon cost associated because of the increased concrete required. On the other hand, it seems like there's problems with loss of space for housing if we have outdoor parking lots and sort of things in there. You said we were moving towards more flexible planning, but what are the options beyond internal and external that would be of benefit to communities?
I think that's really becomes the crux of the question is internal and external. We've all learned from UBCO downtown that underground is simply not an option in our community. It's even worse from a climate perspective in terms of embedded carbon. So you're really picking options here. Ultimately, my philosophy here, and this is a philosophy from Donald Shoup. He's kind of the I highly recommend. He's a very nice old man who has a blog still, but he's a professor of urban planning at UCLA, and his full argument, and this has been borne out in Edmonton and High River, is that the correct amount of parking will get built, and this could be internal in the podium itself. It could be a parking lot beside a building, but it's just sometimes there's some spatial allocation issues by trying to do this with a regulation as opposed to trying to do this by, ultimately what comes down to businesses selling to their customers, be it a rental building, be it an ownership building. So I think it's entirely possible that even if these regulations were removed out of the city zoning bylaw, that the amount of parking provided would stay the same, go up, go down. It's kind of hard to predict. And you need to be managing, as Shoup talks about in his book, and as videos on the topic talk about as well. You need to still manage. Street parking becomes an issue. You start talking about permitting like they do in the heritage area where there are no garages or less garages, like I talked about earlier in my presentation. But yeah, those are kind of your options. You have parking lots, you have above ground parkades, and you have street parking. And from a climate perspective, some people are forced, particularly in affordable housing buildings. We saw this with certain buildings that were built in the North End, and with rental buildings, there is parking that isn't being used by the tenants, and this has a carbon impact. So potentially a little bit less gets built. Some people who don't need to buy a spot don't buy a spot, and then they live their car-free lives anyways. Personally speaking, I just bought my first home, and it's in a building built in the 90s, and I'm probably going to be car-free, but I get a parking spot with it. So I'm not sure what I'm going to use it for. So there are specific types of people. It's a question of philosophy regarding whether it should be more of a parking lot, whether it should be in the bottom of a building, or whether it should be a city planning document determining that, or more of a sales and demand supply arrangement based on the demands of the people who are going to live there. So that's kind of what I was getting at.
There are other questions here.
No.
Thank
Thank you, though. I appreciate the question. It's still very much a topic of discussion, and nobody wants people who have cars to not have parking spots. That's just crazy.
I was going to make a suggestion on what to do with your parking spot, Davis. I think you could change it into like a bicycle spot and have some of those really good lock-in devices, so that other tenants in the building can rent a spot to keep their bicycle safe and then share that with the city.
Well, I'll definitely have something to talk to the Strata Council about. Thank you, Tracy.
And then the other thing is, like I'm the same. I don't have a car. My two kids don't have a car. Really, there should be some options within, if it's a building with a decent number of units, there should be something like a 10% ratio where you don't have to buy a parking spot. And, I don't see why we can't have a car share in buildings like that. For the people who don't have a car, may want to use one once in a while, but not forcing them to spend the amount of money because they're paying for it and you can't even recoup that amount of money back, even if you rent it out to people. You hear that argument, or rent it out. $150,000, how long would that take? You know, like you're going to be looking like a raisin and you still won't have paid it off with the rent.
Yeah, I think that's right. That both you, Tracy, and Terry Bridges in chat. Thanks, Terry. Touching on car share spots. Thankfully, we're seeing a little bit of that. Personally speaking, I'm probably going to end up using that kind of thing because there are things where you just need a vehicle. That's just true, even if you have a cargo bike. So, car share is a wonderful modern invention, and I'd like to see more support of that in new developments for sure.
Yeah, I think it would be great if we just kind of. I did actually hope to have Modo Car Share speak this week, but it wasn't possible. I really think we need to build on getting a movement and having people write to council saying, I use car share. I don't want to spend this amount of money on a parking lot, on a parking stall. Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize things. If somebody else has a question, step forward. Otherwise, one quick question. Seems to me that yes, we do need cars, but we bend over backwards for the private vehicle. I'm wondering what your thoughts are instead of trying to maximize parking spots, which I know people live places and they need places to park their vehicle if they have one. But what about the approaches, say, from London, England, or Singapore, where you start to zing people for using their vehicle, driving places, crossing zones, as a means of starting to get people to cut back on private vehicles and all the emissions that are associated with that. I'm told 30% of the emissions are our own cars. I know that's a stick as opposed to a carrot method, and I know that there's penalties for politicians that might ever propose that, but what are your thoughts, Avis, on that?
I think that it does come down to a political problem. I think in large cities that have adequate transit, New York City actually just did this. You mentioned the London zone as well. I think there's an argument to be made in those cities where they have large subway systems, where they have large rapid transit systems. I don't think Kelowna would ever be in that space. We don't even have control of our local transit authority. The Okanagan Transit Alliance is trying to change that. We don't have even bus rapid transit lines in our community. We don't have a fully built protected bike lane network in our community. So I think it would be almost unfair to a large percentage of the population if we were going to try to ever use sticks like that, because there isn't, for many people, especially those people who are living in those outlying areas, and even some people who live closer in, it's just not a real practical possibility for them. So I can understand why those cities are using them, because on the face of it, there are a lot of problems with that kind of dependency in terms of climate impacts. But I think in Kelowna's case, funding for carrots, with better transit, with bus priority transit, with continued investments in sidewalk infrastructure, better intersections with roundabouts and traffic circles and protected bike lanes. All of these are carrots. And I think that we're all going to make progress if we continue with the carrot approach. I would only say that in Vancouver in 2022, they had an election defined on a hypothetical congestion charge that didn't exist, and the mayor and council were all swept out of power just on the hypothetical possibility of there being of that kind of thing. So it's a non-starter, and it works in big cities, big cities, but in Kelowna, best to stick with carrots.
There's a lot of pushback. People are so invested in having a personal vehicle. It's almost like part of their identity, and they're very aggressive. You know, you see the amount of pickup trucks that people have as a personal use vehicle. They're never hauling lumber or moving furniture around. It's just the fact that it's big. And that's, so it's the identity. I have a big pickup truck. Some of these trucks are level with my shoulders, if not even more so. They're not going to see me. I crossed the street at a crosswalk downtown. Downtown, just at the corner of Bernard, right? It's not exactly a place where you can speed. And so the truck driver saw me, they slowed down, but as soon as I had crossed, they really put the foot to the pedal and like really kind of took off as if to say, you hateful person for slowing me down. If only I could have run you over, you know? So that's when you have that mentality, it's very difficult to sort of talk about choices, because it's choices. Go ahead, Laurie.
I was just going to say that Canada is so big, and our towns and cities are so far apart, and they're so spread out that without the public transit, really good public transit to get us from place to place, like in the meeting the other day, somebody said in Victoria, people don't need to have cars because the services are so convenient. But where we are, it is a real issue to do all, can be, to do all of our things, especially if we are disabled. It's really hard to get out and manage those. It all sort of needs to be done gently. Those carrots have to be mashed. Mashed carrots has to be done so gently so that we can make that change in the face of resistance, which is very strong. People are quite afraid of losing whatever it is they have that makes their lives comfortable until they are disabled or until they're in a situation where they can't drive, and then they realize the problem with not building better towns. And I'm not sure without the vision at all levels, like 880 cities or cities for everyone or strong towns, without that in our communities, it's really difficult to raise that awareness and get people on board, especially with planners who are trained in a certain way of looking at development. So very hopeful, but see the challenges.
Absolutely. There are so many. And I think that's what it comes down to, a matter of really recognizing what we want to do here. And that's why that rhetoric around options, which is what I sincerely believe, becomes so important. I think we lose whenever, like, there's some very edgy podcasts that exist online talking about like the war on cars and that kind of thing. And even as someone who's a big bike guy, I just don't think that's helpful, because I think there's a reason why almost everyone drives, and why our society has become this way. And I don't think it's a grand conspiracy necessarily from oil companies. I think that cars are a very good tool and that people need them for a lot of reasons. And it's just about building a city that works for everyone, works for people who walk, who cycle, who take transit, and who drive, and retaining that functionality for people who drive, whether they're disabled, whether they're elderly, whether they're just with a family, whatever it is. I think going beyond that and into a more aggressive tone would be a serious mistake for the climate movement, because I just don't think I think it's one where the people who are, and I've met some people like this, is there's actually a couple members who used to be on our board who were like this, that were very, very militant. But I think in the end, you lose more people than the people you inspire. So I think, yeah, that the kind of rising tide approach that lifts all boats is probably going to get us further.
And just before I get Grace to ask a question or make a comment, there's a comment in the chat. Davis, could you give me some good articles and books to help us get up to speed on urban planning and the issues you've talked about? So if you're able to just send me a few of those, because I will be sending a follow-up email with future action items and resources, that would be great. And, do you happen to have a date? You said about a Strong Towns meeting towards the end of the month.
No, I don't have the actual date yet. I'm working with the library, for the first couple of meetings, I'm probably going to promote it through a couple of channels, including the Cycling Coalition, OTA, KCC, just because I don't want to no one to show up. So when that news comes out, if you're on one of these email lists, you'll probably figure it out that way. I see
Okay.
that Grace has a hand up as well.
Yeah, go for it, Grace.
Well, my question is, I really liked your picture of no sidewalks. And in terms of the construction, I'm disabled myself, a walker dependent, have been for a number of years now. The other thing I want to ask about the structure of that, would it then be cheaper because were they made of cement or what? Because, you know, sidewalks are so expensive and all the rebar and everything they have put in and the big carbon footprint. In terms of carbon footprint, do you know if there was anything costed out with the ones, you know, that really lovely picture you showed with no stepping down on sidewalks or stepping up rather?
I think that they just there's a couple different ways I've seen this. They have some of these at Orchard Plaza where they do it just with a raised asphalt. That specific picture, I believe, is stamped concrete, but I'm not an engineer. I've seen them done a couple different ways. Typically, traffic engineers, and we've had this problem with the city of Kelowna, come right out and admit they don't do it because it's too expensive, or because even on a neighborhood road, not an arterial road like Gordon or Benvolen, they don't do this on a neighborhood road because it drives the project price up and it might slow traffic down, even if it happens to be in a school zone. And I'm not talking about Gordon here. So it comes down to a question of budget and a question of values from planners, transportation engineers, and elected officials. So we could do this. There is the occasional continuous sidewalk that goes halfway on the new Casorso active transportation corridor. There's one where it's a level crossing to get across the bike lane, and then they have you step down to the curb to meet the road, and that's on, I believe, getting closer to KLO, but still going towards Casorso on the new protected bike lane there. It's halfway. So we've mentioned this kind of thing to the city, that in neighborhoods where you would support traffic calming, where you would want 30 or 40-kilometer-hour speed limits, there's no reason why you can't have these effective speed humps that are just better, that replace sidewalks with raised sidewalks. It's just a matter of budget. So they're aware, they know all of these things. It's just about making it a priority for them. And yeah, thank you for sharing, because it is a massive accessibility issue. And I've heard that from a couple people, but it's good to hear from lived experience that this is something that affects you. And it's something we take in our advocacy efforts. I'm fairly certain that the people on the Disability Advocacy Committee at City Hall, Peter Trush, for example, I think he's spoken about this before. I'm hopeful that in urban areas, so in the Pandosy Town Center, in the downtown, and in suburban areas where it's not an arterial road, we can get a new traffic design standard so that when roads are repaved, these are automatically added. The city's unwilling to go there due to the cost, but fingers crossed that gets changed over time. That's about the new intersection and new road design guidelines that Kelowna Area Cycling Coalition would like to see in our community.
See, what the city often doesn't realize, every driveway, if you're in a wheelchair or you're a walker, especially if you're in a wheelchair, it'll just take you away and you'll run right into the street. It's horrible. Like, if they took that into account, I really would like to see the cost effective. I think that they could do this cheaper and just have it level.
I agree. They really should be able to do this. It is really a matter of basic accessibility and dignity. And you know, if Tracy or yourself, Grace, if you want to connect me after this meeting, I think it would be good for you to be able to bring this concern to the Accessibility Advisory Committee, because they have an Accessibility Advisory Committee at City Hall for a reason. And this is something that they would be more than happy to work on. So I would encourage you to connect with us and to bring your concerns to the committee so they can bring them to council.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Lau-
David. It's great.
Laurie just put something in the chat, and I was just thinking of this. Tirana, Albania, the mayor had his planners walk around the city with a stroller to see how difficult it is to manage corners and driveways. I was going to suggest that they walk around with someone next to someone in a wheelchair, but that is very inspired to actually have them use a device themselves. So either borrow a wheelchair, although I don't know what the liability implications would be if they broke it, or to use an actual stroller themselves. That is, Grace, I think this is the way to go. He also had them kneel at corners to get to the height of children to see the risks. Yeah, like I'm the height of kids. Seriously. The kids are taller than me. Oh, Laurie is such a font of information. I don't even know how to express what Laurie does to the climate movement. Yeah, these are all great ideas.
Thank you, Lori. Yeah, Cities for Everyone. What a fantastic resource. You really know what you're talking about. And I didn't even know that story from Albania. Thank you. Oh, Tracy, I see you're on mute now.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Okay, so I do want to raise one thing that I was talking to Davis about. There is a transportation tour that City of Kelowna council are taking on Monday morning, and I think it's 7 projects, one of which is called the Birch Road extension, and it actually goes just by the side of Munson Pond. I don't know if anybody has seen is it the Daily Courier? Can't remember what it's called. Yeah, the Daily Courier this week. And there was an article, and the article is absolutely incredibly informative about this pond, how it was all cleaned up, how all the toxins were removed, and only, was it 2018, there was a request to have a dog park just to the west of it. And they said, no, that's not allowed because it would not be good for the pond. But now that is exactly where they're thinking of a road going. So, it would be incumbent upon people to write to City Council about this. The tour itself is on Monday, which is Earth Day. The irony here. And I will see what I can cobble together in the follow-up email, which might be a bit later today. I've got some obligations this afternoon. But there's also a scavenger hunt downtown in Kelowna, which is organized by the City of Kelowna. That would be a good place to mention some of the comments and topics we've heard today and throughout the week. There's also an event happening at the library with Kelowna Tree Protectors, a park of your dreams. And this is at 1:30, the downtown location of the library. And you're just going to get the chance to just draw what you want in a park. And all this information is going to be assembled, and then Kelowna Tree Protectors are going to speak to the city. So I'm going to be at both of those events. And I think that is it for the Earth Day weekend. There are events happening in Vernon, which Grace already knows about. And then next week, I have 2 items. There is the Kelowna Climate Coalition's second town hall. That is going to be on Tuesday, April the 23rd at Okanagan College at Roz. Do you want to remind me what time? Is it 6:30? Yes, 6:30. And I will include that in the follow-up information. And then next Wednesday is the Subic Oil webinar. So again, watch this space. I'll include the registration link. The folks at Subic Oil are doing an Okanagan webinar, which the hub is hosting, and you'll get to hear various information on that. So with that, thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Davis, my future counsellor. Can't plug that enough.
Yes. Thumbs up.
I think I'm going to get a tattoo.
Well,
And
Gracie, we gotta. If you want change in this city, it's gonna take more than one person. I just don't want to disappoint anyone by raising expectations too high here now.
yeah, I
But I
know.
appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you everyone for coming here today. I appreciate the audience. I hope you learned something, and please feel free to reach out to me. And of course, we have the one person who'd like some follow-up resources. If there's anything you'd like to learn, anything you'd like to learn more about, I'm an open book. Reach out and on any kind of social media or my email, which is public, and I'll arrange the time. So thank you very much for coming here today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Tracy. Bye for everything.